How Hurricane Katrina cost America $200 billion. One levee, one weak spot, one wall that gave way. That's really where this whole thing begins. Not the hurricane itself, not the wind. A wall of dirt and concrete, built to hold back water, had been quietly falling apart for decades before anyone even noticed. Engineers had been flagging problems with that system for years before the storm ever showed up. So, let's talk about how long those warnings got ignored and what that silence ultimately cost. Hurricane Katrina hit the Louisiana coast on August 29, 2005 as a Category 3 storm. Now, Category 3 is bad, no question, but it's not the worst a hurricane can get. New Orleans had made it through Category 3 storms before. What it had never dealt with was this. Within hours, more than 50 separate levee and floodwall breaches opened up, and water started pouring in from every direction at once. Around 80% of the city went underwater. Some neighborhoods got more than 15 feet of it. The American Society of Civil Engineers later called it the worst engineering catastrophe in U.S. history. Not the worst natural disaster, the worst engineering catastrophe. Keep that distinction in your head, because it's the whole reason we're here. And by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly why it matters. Even before a single levee broke, tens of thousands of people who had no way to evacuate were already crowding into the Louisiana Superdome, the city's last resort shelter. Within a day, the power went out. Within 2, the toilets stopped working completely, and thousands of people were stuck inside a building with no plumbing in the middle of August. Supplies were gone in days. More than 20,000 people ended up trapped inside a stadium made for football games, not for a week-long humanitarian emergency. A few miles away at the New Orleans Convention Center, thousands more had gathered, and basically no organized supplies were making it to them at all. Those images became the defining footage of the entire disaster. But here's the question that actually matters, the one a Senate investigation spent months trying to figure out. Why were these people there to begin with, packed into a building that was never designed for any of this? The answer points straight back to a wall. Most people imagine a hurricane destroying a city with brutal winds and nonstop rain. That's not what happened here. Over 4 decades, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers constructed a 350-mile network of levees and floodwalls around New Orleans, spending roughly $738 million to do it. The whole project kicked off after Hurricane Betsy swamped the city back in 1965. A federal investigation the very next year uncovered some serious problems. Not enough funding, incomplete data on the ground the system was built on, and in a few critical locations, straight-up design flaws. Some floodwalls were sitting on foundations that were never going to stop a major storm surge, no matter how high you built them. The soil underneath was simply too weak. Here's the blunt takeaway from that finding. You can put up the most powerful wall imaginable, but if you put it on ground that can't hold, the wall goes down with it. The storm surge was already punching through sections of that system before Katrina's worst winds had even fully shown up. Water ripped through the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, and the Industrial Canal. Just 3 of more than 50 different failure points scattered across the metro area. Studies done afterward concluded that the levee failures, not the wind, were responsible for the vast majority of both the flooding and the deaths. Wind didn't destroy New Orleans. A wall did. Now let's talk about the human cost, and it's worth being upfront about how unsettled this number actually is. Early reports put the death toll somewhere above 1,800. In 2023, the National Hurricane Center wrapped up a formal reassessment and pulled the confirmed number down to just under 1,400, while at the same time pushing the damage estimate up to around $186 billion. That puts Katrina at the top as the deadliest American hurricane in about 50 years, and still today, 2 decades later, the single most expensive hurricane ever recorded. Depending on how you count things, total damage estimates over the years have ranged anywhere from $108 billion to $190 billion. Nearly every serious estimate puts Katrina right at or near the top. Let's put $190 billion into something you can actually wrap your head around. That's roughly 8 full years of NASA's entire annual budget gone because of a single storm that lasted less than a day. The recovery didn't reach everyone the same way, and that's really where the human tragedy of this story hits hardest. The lower 9th Ward was sitting right next to that breached Industrial Canal floodwall, and it got absolutely devastated, as hard as any neighborhood in this country has ever been hit by a flood. Its recovery trailed years behind the wealthier, less flooded parts of the city. Go walk through the lower 9th Ward today, 20 full years later, and you'll still come across empty lots where people's homes used to be. Nobody ever rebuilt them. Federal recovery money did make it into the city, billions of dollars worth. But getting access to that money often came down to things like pre-storm home equity and insurance coverage, things that were already unevenly spread around before Katrina even hit. The people who bore the worst of the disaster weren't the same people who got the most out of the recovery. That empty lot in the lower Ninth Ward? That's what $190 billion looks like when it doesn't reach everybody equally. That's the human piece. Now let's get into where the money actually went, step by step. Because just like every disaster we've covered in this series, the bill didn't show up all at once. Let's start with property. Around 800,000 housing units across the Gulf Coast were damaged or wiped out entirely. In New Orleans alone, floodwaters pushed out roughly 770,000 people. A lot of them didn't come back for months. A pretty significant chunk never came back at all. The city's population fell by more than half in the years right after the storm, and even 2 decades out, it still hasn't climbed back to where it was before Katrina. So let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program, basically the federal government's own flood insurance setup. And look, the numbers here get a little overwhelming, so let's just take it slow. Before Katrina hit, this program had a borrowing limit of $1.5 billion from the US Treasury. That was it. That was the whole safety net. Then Katrina came, and right behind it came Hurricane Rita, and together they absolutely shattered that limit. Congress had to step in and bump it up to around $20.8 billion, and that happened within about 6 months. Think about what that actually means. A program that was never supposed to owe more than $1.5 billion suddenly owed more than 13 times that amount. Pretty much overnight. And here's the really painful part. It never bounced back. Almost 2 decades later, in 2022, the program was still sitting on roughly $20.5 billion in debt to the Treasury. All of it tracing back to one storm season, 2005. And that debt? It's costing taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars every single year, just in interest. And that's before one single new claim even gets paid. Now, private insurance took a serious beating too. And what happened after that completely changed the industry. Katrina racked up around $105 billion in insured losses in today's money. That's according to Swiss Re, one of the biggest reinsurance companies in the world. And get this, 20 years later, it still holds the record as the most expensive natural catastrophe the global insurance industry has ever dealt with. Any disaster, any type, anywhere on the planet. When you add in uninsured losses on top of that, you're looking at roughly $225 billion total. Some smaller regional insurers just couldn't survive it. They folded completely. The bigger players responded by quietly dropping tens of thousands of coastal policies over the years that followed. And then this really interesting kind of ugly fight broke out over one very specific question. Was the damage caused by wind, which homeowners insurance typically covers, or by water, which requires a completely separate federal flood policy? Insurers had a very real financial reason to label as much damage as possible as water damage. And here's exactly what that meant in practice. Every single dollar they could successfully call flood damage was a dollar that came off their balance sheet and landed on the American taxpayer instead. The storm didn't just hit the Gulf Coast. It hit every gas tank across the country. Here's why. The Gulf Coast is home to a massive chunk of America's oil refining capacity. Katrina wiped out around 90% of Gulf oil production and roughly 10% of the nation's total gasoline output. At least 20 offshore platforms were damaged, sank, or just broke completely free. Gas prices were already high before any of this happened. Then they blew past $3 a gallon nationwide in just days. Think about that. A hurricane makes landfall in Louisiana, and by the end of the week, prices are rising at gas stations in Ohio. The U.S. Commerce Department later reported that consumer spending across the whole country dropped by 1% the following month, the steepest single-month decline since the aftermath of 9/11. And back on the ground near the storm, the damage kept piling up for months. In the 10 months after Katrina, an estimated 95,000 people in New Orleans alone lost their jobs. That's about $2.9 billion in lost wages just from one city on top of everything else that was already being counted. Then you've got FEMA's response, which became its own separate lesson in how emergency spending can go badly wrong even when the intentions are decent. FEMA purchased around 145,000 travel trailers to house displaced families. The price tag, roughly $2.7 billion. On the surface, that sounds like a reasonable move in a crisis. Here's what was actually going on. Those trailers were full of formaldehyde, When the government finally ran tests, they found formaldehyde levels running about 5 times higher than what you'd normally find in a home. That's a known carcinogen. And some families were living in these things for years, breathing it in every single day. FEMA got internal warnings about this as early as 2006. Congressional investigators later found that the agency essentially did nothing meaningful in response for nearly 2 years. One House committee came up with a phrase for that. They called it an official policy of premeditated ignorance. Sit with that for a moment, because there's a lot packed into it. This wasn't some surprise nobody saw coming. It was a warning. One that sat on someone's desk for 2 years while families kept breathing in toxic air. When the government finally came clean in 2008, it was stuck with over 100,000 contaminated trailers it couldn't just toss out. Most ended up auctioned off for pennies on the dollar, with stickers telling buyers not to actually live in them. The lawsuits over health damage dragged on for years and finally settled at $42.6 million, split across tens of thousands of people. When you add up the failed units, the health claims, and what it cost just to get rid of everything, some estimates put the total price tag of that trailer program at around $9 billion. Now here's the part I really want you to pay attention to, the same way we did with that valve sitting a mile underwater, or a test that ran for exactly 36 seconds. Nobody was blindsided by this. The Army Corps of Engineers itself later admitted, in its own words, that what it called a levee system was really just a system in name only. Engineers inside and outside the Corps had been raising the alarm for years, pointing to funding gaps and specific weak spots. Those warnings just kept getting drowned out by every other infrastructure priority across the country, inside a political funding process that one government watchdog report flat out described as distorted by earmarks and short-term thinking instead of actual long-term engineering risk. By the time Katrina made landfall, the Corps had already poured roughly $123 billion into flood control nationwide since the 1920s. And yet, average annual flood damage across the country had nearly tripled in real dollars in the years leading up to the storm. The system was expensive to build and expensive to keep running, and it still wasn't enough, not when you measure it against what one single failure would end up costing. What happened next genuinely changed the way the federal government approaches protecting a major American city from flooding. In the 10 years after Katrina, Congress poured over $14 billion into rebuilding and seriously upgrading New Orleans' flood defenses. The new system was engineered to handle what engineers call a 100-year storm. Basically, a storm that has a 1% chance of showing up in any single year. Close to 200 miles of levees across 3 parishes got rebuilt or reinforced. The Corps alone spent nearly $1 billion just on closing and fortifying the outfall canals, the ones whose collapse had drowned some of the worst-hit neighborhoods back in 2005. And because the whole thing was labeled a repair project instead of new construction, the federal government picked up pretty much the entire tab. 20 years on, that story still isn't wrapped up. And honestly, it never will be. Engineering assessments published right around the storm's 20th anniversary showed that New Orleans' flood walls are still sinking. We're talking almost 2 inches a year in certain spots. So the monitoring, the reinforcement, the spending, none of that ever actually stops. It just becomes a permanent line in the federal budget for as long as a major American city continues sitting below sea level. Okay, one more number, and you might want to brace yourself for this one. After Katrina, residents and businesses started filing claims against the Army Corps over the levee failures. In total, nearly 489,000 claims came in. 247 of those were each seeking at least $1 billion. And then there was one single plaintiff who filed a claim for roughly $3 quadrillion, a number so absurdly large that economists noted it was several times bigger than the entire gross domestic product of the United States, in one lawsuit. Now, most of these were, as one economist who looked into them put it, just a negotiating tactic, swing for the fences, then come down from there. But buried somewhere in that mountain of inflated numbers was one that was genuinely serious. The city of New Orleans itself filed a claim for around $77 billion against the Corps, a direct accusation that a federal agency's own engineering calls had helped destroy the very city it existed to protect. Here's the thing. That distinction I made at the start of this video, it actually matters. Not the worst natural disaster, the worst engineering catastrophe. A natural disaster is something no one could have stopped. An engineering catastrophe is something someone could have. Just look at the whole picture laid out together. A levee system that took 4 decades and $738 million to build, sitting on foundations that couldn't hold up, collapsed at over 50 points in just a few hours and set off somewhere between $108 billion and $190 billion in damage. It pushed hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes. Some of them never came back. It buried a federal insurance program in debt it still hasn't dug out of 2 decades later. It launched a trailer program that ended up making the very families it was supposed to protect sick. Hurricane Katrina wasn't just a storm no one could have prevented. It was a storm that found every single weak point in a system that had been starved of funding and proper engineering for decades. And the price of that gap, the gap between what got built and what actually needed to be built, is something New Orleans and the federal government are both still paying. One levee inspection at a time, one interest payment at a time. So if a wall made of dirt and concrete that cost $738 million could spiral into damage on that scale, the next question kind of asks itself. What happens when the thing that fails isn't a physical wall at all, but a single line of code? That's what the next video is about.
Hi guys, welcome to my video. Please keep in mind that everything is in this video is fictional and contains predictions. I produce all the videos on this channel by myself. It means a lot to me. If you like the video and leave comments, thank you, enjoy the video.